Get back to economy. This seat isn't for people like you." That's what the flight attendant snapped as she blocked him from sitting down, her tone sharp, her eyes scanning him like he didn't belong. The cabin froze. Passengers glanced up, some amused, some indifferent, but no one stopped her. A black man in a tailored suit, holding a first-class ticket, had just been humiliated at 36,000 feet, not because he was rude, not because he was late, but because of the color of his skin. They saw his face and made a decision: undeserving. What followed was a slow, deliberate campaign to push him out, denying service, calling security, even spilling hot coffee on his belongings. But what no one knew was that the man they tried to humiliate held the power to bring down everything they stood on. This wasn't just about prejudice. It was about arrogance, unchecked, loud, and public. And by the end of this flight, those same people who laughed, whispered, and judged, they'd be the ones begging for silence. So now the question's yours. What would you do if that was you in 2A? Tell us where you're watching from, drop your thoughts in the comments, and hit like if this made you feel something, because this is just the beginning. Subscribe now and witness how justice takes off. Darren Blake moved through the terminal like a man who had done this 1,000 times, not because he was used to luxury, but because he'd earned every inch of it. His charcoal gray suit was tailored to perfection, subtle but commanding. His shoes, polished Italian leather, clicked softly across the floor as he made his way toward the gate. The boarding pass in his hand read First Class C2A, and the name on it, Darren W. Blake, meant something in his world, though clearly not in everyone's. When Group 1 was called, Darren stepped forward, flashing his ID and pass with a calm nod. The gate agent barely looked at him before waving him through. It was smooth, efficient. For a moment, everything felt exactly the way it should be. But the moment he stepped onto the aircraft, that sense of balance began to shift. The cabin door opened into the hushed world of first class. Wood grain accents, champagne flutes glistening on tray tables, the subtle hum of wealth. Just as he crossed the threshold, a flight attendant, tall, blonde, and crisp in her posture, intercepted him. Her smile was thin, professional, and cold. "Sir, this section is reserved for first-class passengers only," she said, her tone more reprimand than question. Darren didn't flinch. He simply raised his boarding pass and held it between them. "I know," he said evenly. The smile faltered. She glanced at the ticket, her eyes scanning too long for something that should have been obvious. Her lips twitched. "Ah, of course. My apologies." She stepped aside. Darren nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. He made his way down the aisle, aware of the eyes that followed him, the slight hush that always accompanied the unexpected. It wasn't new. It was just exhausting. He found a seat, 2A, next to the window, precisely as it should be. He opened the overhead bin and stowed his briefcase, careful with the handle, then removed a slim leather folder and his tablet. As he sat, he adjusted his cuffs and took a slow breath, forcing his shoulders to relax. A man seated diagonally across the aisle, mid-50s with thinning silver hair and a navy pinstripe suit, leaned toward the woman beside him and muttered, "Probably got a free upgrade. You know how these things work these days." His voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't soft enough to be private. Darren heard it. So did the woman. She gave a small, polite laugh. Darren didn't turn his head. He didn't respond. He tapped his tablet to life and scrolled to a report he had nearly memorized. Numbers, strategy, timelines. He used them like armor. He let the whisper slide off his shoulders, even as it dug a little deeper than he wanted to admit. Moments later, another passenger came through the curtain, looked at Darren, then checked his own ticket, confused. He turned and walked back toward coach. Darren noticed. So did the same flight attendant, who offered the lost man a warm, helpful tone completely different from what she had given Darren minutes earlier. She guided the man kindly, gently touching his arm, pointing toward the back. Then she looked at Darren again, and this time, her face was unreadable. He watched her walk past, saying nothing, the bile in his throat held down by years of self-control. He had learned not to react. Not right away. At least, not where they could twist it. 10 minutes passed. The cabin filled. Soft jazz piped in over the speakers. Glasses clinked. Seat backs clicked upright. The silver-haired man had now leaned back, sipping what looked like scotch, and glanced Darren's way again, this time with a smirk. Darren held his gaze. The man blinked first. Just as Darren turned back to his tablet, a young woman walked by, early 20s, oversized designer sunglasses, Instagram-famous demeanor. She gave him a quick once-over, then resumed her search for her seat, which wasn't in first class. Darren exhaled slowly, reminded again that visibility didn't equal validation. It was always like this. His skin, his posture, his silence, all mistaken for something unearned. They saw his face and wrote the rest of the story without asking a single question. But this was his seat, paid for, reserved, and he wasn't moving. When Rachel, the same flight attendant, returned with a tray of pre-departure drinks, she offered champagne to every other passenger with eye contact and a smile. Darren received his glass without either. Her hand paused at his row. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, as if it were a favor. "Champagne's fine," he replied, not looking up. She poured it without comment and moved on. Darren raised the glass to his lips and took a measured sip. Cold, crisp, detached, just like the service. It wasn't the insult that stung, it was the pattern. The familiar choreography of exclusion dressed up in manners. First the question, then the doubt, then the dismissal. He had been through it in boardrooms, in five-star hotels, even at the gates of his own real estate development projects. But somehow, on airplanes, it always landed harder. The whispers hadn't stopped, they'd simply changed direction. Muted judgments exchanged in subtle glances, in the way Rachel, the flight attendant, seemed to double-check her service cart every time she passed him, as if expecting something to go wrong. 10 minutes after boarding had completed, while most passengers were settling into in-flight menus or closing laptop lids, Darren noticed movement at the front of the cabin. A man in a dark blue blazer with no name tag, aviation security, stepped in quietly but purposefully. He spoke to Rachel, who glanced in Darren's direction before nodding curtly. The man approached Darren's row, his voice low, his demeanor overly polite in a way that suggested practiced formality, not respect. "Sir," he began, his voice smooth as a glass surface hiding tension beneath. "May I see your identification?" Darren blinked once, setting his tablet aside. "Is there an issue?" he asked, calm but firm. "Just a routine verification," the man said, smiling without warmth. "It's a random check." Darren handed over his passport, watching the man as he scanned the details with unnecessary slowness. No one else was being asked. No one else was being randomly verified. It wasn't lost on Darren, nor on a few alert passengers watching the exchange. When the security agent finally handed it back, his nod was mechanical. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. But the pause before he turned away made Darren uneasy. He watched the man walk back to Rachel and whisper something. She tapped on her tablet, glanced back at Darren's row, and entered something into the manifest system. Darren knew enough about how these systems worked. He'd helped fund startups that sold internal CRM tools to airlines. He'd seen the back-end UI, and he recognized the posture of someone entering a behavioral tag. He leaned slightly forward, his voice low but piercing. "Did you just flag me as disruptive?" Rachel stiffened, caught in the act. "Of course not, sir," she replied too quickly. "We just noted that you were involved in an ID check." "That I didn't request," Darren said, his tone sharper now, still controlled. "And that no one else went through." Rachel's face shifted, her practiced professionalism faltering for a second. "I can have the flight manager come speak with you if you'd like." "No need," Darren said, leaning back slowly. "But I'd suggest you double-check the audit log on your manifest entries before takeoff. The timestamp's going to matter later." She didn't respond, but the look she gave him said everything. She knew he wasn't just another passenger. She just didn't know what kind he was yet. Around him, the atmosphere had cooled. The couple across the aisle was suddenly very interested in the wine list. The man who'd whispered about upgrades now studied his hands. And Rachel, though she maintained her composure, avoided Darren's row on her next pass, as if proximity to him might provoke another incident. Darren returned to his tablet, but the data on the screen blurred. His mind ticked with precision. There was a pattern here. The warning signs weren't just individual missteps. They were part of an internal logic designed to escalate suspicion while maintaining plausible deniability. It was always dressed in professionalism, but underneath, it was biased by design. They wanted a reason, not to solve a problem, but to manufacture one. To justify the discomfort they felt simply because he belonged where they didn't believe he should. He could feel it, how easily one click, one notation in the system, could ripple into consequences he didn't deserve. He'd seen it before, in high-end hotels, in boardrooms, at luxury dealerships where sales reps mistook wealth for theft. But here, above the clouds, they thought they had the upper hand. The ID check had barely ended when a voice from 2 rows ahead cut through the soft murmur of the cabin. It belonged to a man with silvered hair, thick-framed glasses, and the self-assured posture of someone used to getting what he wanted without asking twice. He turned slightly in his seat, angling his voice just enough for others to hear without speaking directly to Darren. "Didn't realize economy came with VIP attitudes," he said, the corner of his mouth curled upward in a smirk. His words hung in the air like turbulence before a storm. A few passengers nearby chuckled, some nervously, some eagerly. The woman seated beside him gave him a sideways glance, not quite a smile, but not a protest either. Darren remained still. He didn't rise to bait. His hands were clasped loosely in his lap, but his eyes, now colder, locked onto the back of the man's seat with clinical detachment. He knew this type. A power broker in his own little circle, always mistaking noise for dominance. Darren had out-negotiated his kind in skyscrapers across 4 continents. But here, at 36,000 feet, they thought he was alone, outnumbered and cornered. They thought wrong. Just as the ripple of laughter began to settle, Rachel returned to the front of the cabin with a polished tone and a performative smile. She tapped the PA system, her voice projecting smoothly into every row. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're resolving a seating error. Thank you for your patience while we relocate some passengers." The words were neutral. The tone wasn't. There was no apology, no clarity, just a vague declaration that something was being corrected. Several passengers turned to look. Some leaned slightly in their seats. Darren could feel the eyes again, the speculation. He had become the story, the anomaly in first class who was somehow now a disruption. He glanced up just in time to catch Rachel making eye contact with the silver-haired man who had mocked him. She gave him a nod, not conspiratorial, but complicit. Darren leaned forward and retrieved his briefcase from under the seat. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it, pulled out a small moleskine notebook, and jotted something down. Not because he needed notes, but because the gesture itself was intentional, visible, controlled. It said, "I am still composed. I am still watching. And I will remember." Across the aisle, a woman in her 30s, dressed in a gray pantsuit and scrolling through her phone, looked up and met Darren's gaze. For a fleeting second, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of the head, as if to say, "I see it. I see what they're doing." But like everyone else, she stayed silent. Silence was the currency of survival in spaces like these. And Darren didn't blame her. He just didn't operate by the same rules. From a cockpit area, the flight manager David reemerged and approached row 2. He spoke in a hushed voice to Rachel, then glanced toward Darren. It was the look of someone preparing to de-escalate what they had caused. Darren placed his notebook on the tray table and folded his hands. He was ready. Before David could speak, the silver-haired businessman turned again, louder this time. "Look, I'm just saying, if we're going to start handing out first class like it's a raffle, maybe they should at least dress the part." The line was meant to provoke, to humiliate, to entertain. Darren inhaled slowly, letting the moment fill him without spilling over. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he turned his head and met the man's smug expression with one of calm authority. "Tell me," Darren said, his voice even, "what part of my appearance offends you? Or is it just the part you can't change?" The businessman blinked. The smirk faltered. "Excuse me," he said, but it was weaker now, unsure. Darren leaned back in his seat. "You're excused." For a brief second, silence returned to the cabin, thick and uncomfortable. Rachel shifted awkwardly on her feet. David cleared his throat, then stepped in as if none of it had happened. "Mr. Blake," he began, "would you mind stepping aside for just a moment so we can verify some details with the gate?" Darren raised an eyebrow. "Is my seat still in dispute?" David hesitated. "It's just standard procedure, sir." Darren didn't move. "Then I'll wait here while you standard procedure your way through that system. I'm not going anywhere unless you show me a regulation that justifies this." The tone in his voice wasn't defiant. It was legal. It was lethal. David nodded once, then turned away, murmuring something to Rachel before walking briskly back toward the front. Darren returned his focus to the notebook. They didn't just want him gone, they wanted him small, to disappear quietly and validate their assumptions. But they had misjudged their opponent. Darren was neither small nor silent, and now he was done playing by their script. With composed precision, he unlocked his phone, tapped once, and lifted it to his ear. The moment the name Presidential Liaison lit up on his screen, it drew the attention of the passenger beside him, who instinctively leaned away as if proximity alone might spark backlash. Darren's voice remained low, crisp, and deliberate. "It's me," he said. "They're initiating protocol. Begin the freeze on the cultural logistics contract. I'll confirm within the hour." The line on the other end was silent for a moment, then a simple, "Understood." Darren ended the call, his face unreadable. He knew who was listening. He wanted them to listen. Amanda, the lead flight attendant who had replaced Rachel mid-flight, had hovered near row 2 pretending to check overhead bins, but her eyes had locked on Darren's screen the second she'd seen the contact name. For a split second, her facade cracked, her brow tensed, and her throat bobbed with a nervous swallow. She recognized the name. Darren didn't acknowledge her. He didn't need to. He simply opened his email app and began typing, but before the message could send, a notification popped up. "Connection lost." Reconnecting to onboard Wi-Fi, he tapped the icon again. No network. He tried his secure VPN. Still nothing. A moment later, an announcement chimed over the speaker system, Amanda's voice falsely sweet. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a temporary issue with the Wi-Fi system. Our tech crew is working on resolving it. Thank you for your patience." The words were smooth, practiced, and full of intent. Darren's jaw tightened. They weren't just trying to isolate him. Now, they were trying to silence him. Across the aisle, a few passengers murmured as their Netflix streams or emails dropped offline, but none with the urgency Darren felt. The silence around him shifted into something sharper. This wasn't about comfort anymore. This was control. Amanda returned moments later with a manufactured smile and leaned slightly toward Darren's seat. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" The tone was friendly, but her eyes betrayed calculation. Darren returned her gaze coolly. "Is that offer contingent on what kind of passenger I am, or are we pretending this is still about service?" Amanda's smile stiffened. "I assure you, sir, we treat all passengers with equal care." "Right," Darren said, his voice lower now. "That's why I'm the only one who's had 3 seat checks, a passport verification, and now no access to the only line of communication I need." Amanda blinked once, but didn't respond. Darren leaned back. "I suggest you tell your ground supervisor to check the clause on contractual retaliation. He'll know what I mean." She opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by a call from the front of the cabin. "Amanda, we need you up here." She nodded and left without another word. Darren watched her go, then reopened his notebook and began to write, not just names and events, but timestamps, quotes, expressions, posture, tone. He documented everything with the precision of a man who knew the value of receipts. Meanwhile, the businessman in 2B kept glancing at him, but the confidence in his eyes had faded. There was something different about Darren now, something that made even the arrogant begin to reconsider their footing. A few rows back, the younger woman in the gray pantsuit glanced up from her now disconnected tablet and studied Darren again. This time, she looked less like a bystander and more like someone trying to place a name to a face. He wasn't just writing for himself now. He was preparing documentation that would speak louder than outrage, louder than confrontation. Yet even as he wrote, the situation around him curdled further. A young woman in seat 3C, dressed in designer athleisure with flawless makeup and a phone case plastered in brand logos, held her phone just high enough to catch Darren in frame. The red live stream pulsed on the screen, and her voice, airy and laced with entitlement, carried across the cabin. "This is why first-class standards have dropped," she said, not even pretending to whisper. "I mean, look at this. They'll let anyone up here now. It's getting embarrassing." Her friend beside her, chewing gum with glassy-eyed boredom, nodded and added, "Bet he upgraded on points. Or worse, media pressure." Darren didn't flinch. He didn't even look at them. He simply reached for his water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and took a long sip. But a few rows up, a man in business attire, a hedge fund guy by the look of his Rolex and thin patience, smirked and muttered, "Yeah, probably a diversity PR move. They do that now." His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. Darren had spent years decoding these moments. They thought if they kept it subtle, it couldn't be called out. That if they wrapped insult in casual tone, it became opinion instead of offense. But truth didn't need volume. It just needed attention. The flight crew passed again, this time with drink carts, and as they reached Darren's row, a different attendant, taller, younger, with a sideways smirk and the name tag Kyle, came to a stop beside him. He held a fresh cup of coffee, adjusted his grip once, then leaned as if to hand it across. In a single motion, the cup slipped from his hand, the liquid splashing straight onto Darren's briefcase, the same leather case he had placed carefully beneath the tray. Gasps flickered through the cabin like sparks. The young woman, live streaming, actually laughed aloud. Kyle immediately dropped into a crouch, pulling napkins from his apron, but his voice lacked any true apology. "Oh no," he said, lips curling in mock sympathy. "That must have been, like, faux leather or something, right?" Darren stared down at the spreading stain, then looked up at Kyle with a calm so chilling it turned the smirk into a twitch. "No," Darren said, "that's hand-stitched Berluti, full grain. Roughly $12,000. Kyle's eyes widened slightly, but he recovered with a shrug. "Sorry, man. Just an accident." Darren tilted his head. "I'm sure your supervisor will appreciate hearing it described that way, especially when paired with the footage from her." He nodded toward the live streaming woman, "which I believe is still rolling." Kyle turned to glance behind him, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Darren took a napkin and patted his case once, then calmly set it on the seat beside him. "Don't worry," he said, voice like steel under velvet. "I'll invoice the airline. They know how to reach me." Kyle stood, muttered something unintelligible, and pushed the cart forward. The woman in 3C turned off her phone, suddenly uncomfortable. The performance was unraveling. Yet Amanda returned moments later, as if summoned by tension itself. She stopped by Darren's row, glanced at the stained briefcase, then at Kyle retreating. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Blake?" she asked, but there was no warmth, only protocol. Darren didn't rise to it. "No problem. Just an accident," he said, echoing Kyle's earlier tone with surgical precision. "Though I imagine if this had happened to your chairman's son, someone would be grounded before we reached cruising altitude." Amanda hesitated. She knew she couldn't argue the point without making it worse. Darren's voice dropped an octave, rich with warning. "You're not dealing with someone who panics. I'm patient. But every minute you continue this campaign of performance," he motioned subtly to the staff, the nearby passengers still whispering, "you're writing a case file I don't even have to lift a finger to build." Amanda nodded once, tense, and walked away without another word. The flight moved forward on schedule, but beneath the surface, the tension brewed thick and unspoken, like pressure building behind a wall of glass. Darren sat composed, calm, but not still. His mind kept working, cycling through strategies, calculating leverage, replaying every face, every word, and every opportunity they'd handed him without realizing it. He had said nothing yet, but when he did, it would land like a verdict. A few rows ahead, Amanda stood near the galley, speaking to Kyle and one other crew member. Their voices were low, intended for no one else. But what none of them noticed was that the crew intercom mic had not been turned off properly. A soft mechanical click echoed, and then Amanda's voice crackled over the cabin speakers, clear and unfiltered. "Just keep pushing him until he gets off." The sentence hung in the air, cruel and cutting. The words sliced through the hushed murmur of the cabin like a siren. At first, no one moved, frozen by the sheer bluntness of what had just been said. Then, slowly, necks turned toward Amanda at the front. Even she froze, her eyes widening as the realization hit. Kyle swore under his breath and lunged to switch off the feed. The cabin went dead silent, then buzzed faintly with a sound of tension snapping into open recognition. A man in 1D leaned back and whispered to his wife. The woman who had been live streaming earlier now fumbled to unlock her phone, suddenly aware that what had once seemed like online theater was quickly spiraling into scandal. And Darren? Darren didn't flinch. He simply looked down at his open notebook, drew a line across the page, and wrote one sentence in deliberate, slow letters. "Crew openly admits to targeting passenger recorded." When he looked up again, it wasn't Amanda who met his gaze. It was someone else. Maya, the youngest of the attendants, stood at the edge of his row, her posture stiff, her face pale, but her eyes full of something different. Regret. Recognition. She took a careful step forward, holding a tray of water bottles. And as she bent slightly to offer one to Darren, her other hand slipped something small and folded into the outer pocket of his jacket. She didn't speak. She didn't look him in the eye. But when she straightened and moved on, Darren reached down, retrieved the note, and unfolded it beneath the cover of his tray table. It was scribbled quickly on the back of a napkin, the handwriting neat but nervous. "I know who you are. I'm sorry for what they're doing. Please don't let this change what you're building." Maya. Darren stared at the note for a moment, then carefully folded it again and tucked it into his notebook. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh, but his jaw unclenched slightly, and the fire in his eyes sharpened into focus. There was still integrity in the room, even if it was hiding behind fear. And that meant not everything was broken. Yet, Amanda hadn't returned to the main cabin. Word had clearly reached the cockpit, because a supervisor-level officer stepped out minutes later, walked the length of first class, and whispered something to a crew member near the back. Whatever damage control they were planning, it was too late. Darren knew the intercom slip was recorded on the flight log. He knew the cabin mic feed could be accessed post-flight. He also knew several passengers had heard it, and some had phones in hand, potentially already uploading it. This was no longer just mistreatment, it was confirmation, proof. That changed the game entirely. No more misunderstandings. No more plausible deniability. The crew had spoken their intent over a live broadcast, and the mask had slipped. Amanda had vanished behind the curtain, Kyle was keeping his head down, and Maya hadn't returned. Passengers had shifted from passive observers to uneasy participants, their silence no longer apathy, but fear of what might come next. And Darren? He hadn't moved. Not until now. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his phone once more. The Wi-Fi light was still red, but Darren didn't need it this time. He activated hotspot tethering through a backup SAT-link in his jacket pocket, a luxury most didn't know existed, but one that VIP-level executives were sometimes granted for global travel contingencies. The signal flickered, then locked. The call connected within seconds. He stood up without warning, causing several heads to turn. His voice was low, but firm enough to carry. "Put me through." Now, the screen came to life, revealing the familiar face of Elena Cortez, CEO of Veritas Global Art and Culture. Her backdrop showed the boardroom of a major European museum, sleek, glass-lined, distinctly executive. She blinked at first, surprised. "Darren, are you still in the air?" "I am," he replied evenly. "And you're about to cancel the contract." There was a beat of silence as Elena's brow furrowed. "Cancel." Darren flipped the camera momentarily to show the cabin. The stained briefcase, the crew at a distance, the heads turning, the folded napkin note. Then he panned back to his own face. 17 documented violations. for possible breaches of equal access protocol, an intercom broadcast confirming malicious intent, and one crew member with enough sense to recognize the truth. Elena didn't blink. She simply nodded once sharply. Understood. We'll halt the touring initiative immediately. The contract is suspended pending further review. You have full authorization to make the call. Darren ended the video without another word. He didn't need to explain. Veritas handled global art logistics, including the $1.7 billion cultural exhibit slated to travel across multiple continents, an exhibit that had been set to launch with this very airline as its official transport sponsor. Amanda had just walked into the cabin again when he pocketed the phone. She froze mid-step. Her eyes met Darren's, and for the first time, all trace of control left her face. He saw it then, the recognition. Not fear, not regret. Recognition. She knew who he was. Not just a man in a seat, not just a client. She knew the full scale of what she and her crew had just jeopardized. Darren turned slightly, just enough for his voice to project. You'll want to prepare a statement, he said to her. Because in about 90 minutes, when this plane touches down, the media release goes live, along with the footage, the transcripts, and the full chain of negligence. Amanda's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her skin had lost color. A businessman 3 rows back lowered his tablet. The woman who had mocked Darren earlier now stared at him with wide, frozen eyes. Even Kyle, leaning against the rear galley wall, straightened as if bracing for impact. And Darren didn't sit. Not yet. He remained standing, composed, not gloating, but unshakable. He had given them every chance. Amanda hadn't spoken since. Her posture was rigid, her mouth drawn tight, her mind clearly scrambling for a narrative to mask what had already spiraled out of her control. Kyle had disappeared into the galley, and most of the passengers had ceased pretending to be uninvolved. One by one, phones began appearing discreetly in hands, recording, streaming, capturing a moment that would live far beyond this flight. Darren remained where he was, not for theatrics, but because the silence he commanded now spoke louder than any demand he could make. Then, from across the aisle, a voice finally broke through, a calm, journalistic tone edged with astonishment. Darren Blake, it said. You're the curator for the Veritas World Collection, aren't you? Darren turned slightly, spotting the speaker. A woman in her 40s, dark-rimmed glasses, tablet in hand. Her posture unmistakably familiar. A reporter. Her voice had that deliberate cadence trained in broadcast. Samantha Kruger, she added before he could respond. Global Features, The Atlantic. Darren offered a polite nod. I thought I recognized you. And I didn't recognize you fast enough, she said, her voice rising slightly as she looked around. Because had I known this was you, I would have been live 10 minutes ago. She tapped her tablet twice, and a red light blinked on. We are now. Amanda visibly paled. Passengers gasped softly as the reporter continued. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm currently on board Flight 312, where Darren Blake, International Curator, Strategic Advisor to the Veritas Global Art and Culture Initiative, and lead partner for the Sky Culture Alliance, was just publicly humiliated, targeted, and undermined by airline staff who had no idea they were mistreating the very architect of their upcoming multi-billion-dollar cultural partnership. The words struck like thunder across the cabin. Someone actually dropped their champagne glass. Amanda instinctively took a step back, her face flushed and frozen. Darren didn't move. He didn't need to. Samantha wasn't finished. The individual you see here, she gestured toward him, is responsible for the brand strategy that would have placed this airline at the cultural forefront of global aviation. That deal is now off the table, and I am recording this because the public deserves to see how easily status blinds judgment, and how power doesn't always look the way you expect it to. The red light blinked steadily. Every second captured a blow to the airline's integrity. A man 2 seats down whispered, "That's the Sky Culture guy? The one behind the Louvre project." Someone else murmured, "He's worth $500 million." Darren simply remained standing, letting the confirmation sink in, not as a flex, but as undeniable proof that truth didn't need to be defended when it stood in plain view. Amanda looked like she wanted to disappear, but no curtain could hide her now. Even Kyle, now halfway out of the galley, looked stunned as the implications unraveled. Meanwhile, Maya, the only attendant who had dared acknowledge the wrong being done, stood quietly by the rear exit. Her eyes met Darren's just for a second. He gave her a subtle nod of thanks, unspoken, but understood. The pilot's voice came over the intercom moments later, tense and unusually personal. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're beginning our initial descent into New York. We'd like to thank you for flying with us and hope to make your arrival as smooth as possible." His voice cracked slightly at the end. He knew. Word had clearly reached the cockpit. This wasn't just another flight anymore. It was a global incident. The hashtag Darren Blake trended within 20 minutes. The video from Samantha's feed hit 6 million views before the wheels touched the tarmac. Amanda stood frozen near the exit door, her uniform pristine, but her confidence gutted, as if her starched blazer could no longer hold together the unraveling reality around her. Kyle remained by the service galley, eyes lowered, every muscle in his body screaming tension. Darren remained seated, his tray table up, his posture composed, not triumphant, just resolute. He had no need to revel in their collapse. Their actions had written their own downfall. As the aircraft taxied to its gate, Maya, the junior attendant, walked down the aisle one last time for cabin check. But this time, she didn't avoid Darren's row. She stopped beside him briefly, handed him a warm towel, and whispered, "They'll call you before we reach baggage." Darren nodded, calm as ever. He already knew. Before the seatbelt light had even gone off, a man in a navy blue suit was waiting at the jet bridge. His ID badge bore the airline's global logo, his expression tight and unforgiving. Amanda saw him and instantly paled. The crew door opened, and he stepped on board with purpose. "Amanda Price," he said, voice clipped but formal. "You're relieved of duty effective immediately. Please surrender your crew badge and step off the aircraft." Gasps rippled quietly through the cabin. Amanda didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply unpinned her badge, handed it over, and walked toward the front with the heaviness of someone watching her entire career dissolve beneath her feet. The man followed, already on his earpiece, likely coordinating HR protocols or press control. At the same time, Richard, the smug businessman who had muttered about upgrades and economy class, received a very different kind of reception. As he retrieved his carry-on from the overhead bin, his phone buzzed. Then again, and again. Each notification hit harder than the last. His company's communications director had left 4 missed calls. The final message read, "We're pulling all external-facing roles. You've become a liability." The smugness left his face immediately. He sat down again, stunned, blinking at the screen like it might give him a different version of reality. It wouldn't. Someone across the aisle, watching, murmured, "Couldn't have happened to a better guy." The cameras waiting beyond the gate weren't for celebrities. They were for consequences. A media cluster had already formed beyond the glass, phones and microphones ready, dozens of journalists pushing for statements. Samantha Kruger, the reporter from The Atlantic, had already filed her story, and the article was now the top trending topic in 3 countries. The headline read, "The man they tried to erase. How a billionaire curator exposed systemic arrogance at 36,000 feet." The airline's social media accounts had gone dark. Comments were disabled, but it didn't matter. Screenshots, video clips, and hashtags were unstoppable now. The public had made its decision. Within hours, major cultural partners had announced they were reviewing all collaborative contracts with the airline. One global arts foundation in Berlin pulled out completely, issuing a formal statement condemning discriminatory conduct. The ripple effect was financial and immediate. By the time Darren had reached the private terminal entrance, the airline stock had dropped 11.4% in pre-market trading. Investment analysts on CNBC and Bloomberg speculated on long-term brand trauma. Board members were summoned for emergency meetings. Meanwhile, Darren stepped into a black SUV waiting at the curb. The driver nodded, already aware. No questions were needed. Inside the car, Darren's assistant was already fielding calls, organizing the next steps. BBC wants an exclusive. CNN's prepping a full-hour panel. And Sky Culture's entire European tour wants your statement before noon. Darren nodded, his voice even. Tell them it's not about me. It's about what happens when silence becomes culture. And what happens when that silence is broken. From his phone, he sent one message, just 4 words, to a private equity contact that had once pitched an airline acquisition. Now is the time. Outside, the crowd grew. The days that followed were not just about fallout, they were about reckoning. The airline scrambled to contain a fire that had already raised the image it had spent decades building. CEOs gave press briefings, legal teams drafted statements, and PR firms worked overtime spinning narratives that came too little, too late. But none of it could outpace the truth that had already taken flight in Darren Blake's silence and the world's collective outrage. Amanda Price, once hailed internally as a leadership model in customer engagement, sat beneath soft studio lighting days later, no longer in uniform, no longer composed. Her face was bare of makeup, her hair pulled back, her voice raw. Cameras rolled as she looked directly into them, not out of confidence, but because there was nowhere else to look. I lost sight of what respect means, she said, her voice trembling. I lived with hate I didn't even understand. Her words didn't excuse her, and she knew it. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't pretend it was a misunderstanding. She simply told the truth, that she had allowed fear and superiority to guide her actions, and that in doing so, she had lost more than her job. She had lost her own reflection. The interview aired on national television. Some scoffed, some cried, but many surprisingly listened. Because in a world exhausted by denial, her admission, however late, felt like a crack in the wall. Meanwhile, the world moved on around her. Darren didn't gloat. He didn't appear on talk shows or write editorials. Instead, he focused his energy elsewhere. 3 weeks after the incident, a press release hit the global wires announcing the launch of the Equi-Flight Initiative, a non-profit consultancy dedicated to reshaping training and accountability standards across the aviation industry. At its helm, appointed by Darren himself, was someone no one expected, Maya Thomas, the quiet, junior attendant who had slipped a napkin note into his jacket pocket when the world around her turned its face. In the press conference, she stood beside Darren, this time not in uniform, but in a tailored blazer, her shoulders no longer hesitant, her voice clear. I don't stand here because I was perfect, Maya said, facing the cameras. I stand here because I made a choice when it mattered, and that choice changed me. The initiative, backed by a multi-million-dollar fund, began by partnering with airlines across the globe, focusing on bias deconstruction, empathy-based training, and real-time accountability mechanisms for crew behavior. Darren remained largely behind the scenes, refusing interviews unless they centered on the mission, not the scandal. For him, it had never been about humiliation. It had been about pattern, about power, and about the cost of letting silence fester. But even in his quiet, his impact echoed. Amanda, months later, volunteered for a pilot mentorship program helping at-risk youth train for aviation careers. She never returned to the skies, but she showed up every week, teaching what not to become. Richard, disgraced and ousted from his own firm, disappeared from public view. Rumors swirled of a ghost-ridden memoir, but none surfaced. As for the airline, its leadership was reshaped from the board down. Their new policy, dubbed the Blake Standard, became a case study in business schools on how one unchecked moment can define or destroy an entire brand. And for the passengers on Flight 312, they remembered. Every year, on the anniversary of the flight, someone tweeted the quote that Darren had quietly offered Maya before stepping into that SUV outside JFK. Sometimes, justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it just takes its seat and lets the truth land. The words became more than a line. They became a lesson. One not just about race or power, but about the strength of restraint, the courage of quiet conviction, and the impossible to ignore gravity of dignity. Because in the end, it wasn't the fall that changed everything. It was who stood up, calmly, deliberately, and with purpose, and reminded the world what respect really looked like. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives just like it. Where are you watching from today? And what part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the public humiliation, the unexpected twist, or the final moment of justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take.